event and celebration of Dr. Lewis Lancaster, and also celebrating the new book edited by Dr. Richard Payne, Scripture Canon, Text and Context, Essays Honoring Lewis R. Lancaster. So we're all very pleased to be here for this book launch, so to speak. Before we get started, I wanted to give a special welcome to several of our guests today. The first one is Jerry Pelton. This is Dr. Lancaster's sister, who is with us today. Jerry. Our other guest is Dr. Donald Swearer, who is our distinguished visiting professor in religious studies. And finally, Dr. Rongdao Lai. Dr. Lai was actually a Bachelor's of Arts degree student here at US.
A very long time ago.
She is now assistant professor in religion at the University of Southern California, and this year she is our alumnus of the year at the University of the West. So thank you all. Before we get started with speaking about the book, we also wanted to celebrate another launch, which is the launch of the iPhone and iPad app of the Digital Sanskrit Buddhist Canon. And to do that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Marosh Shakia up.
So this Digital Sanskrit Buddhist Canon project started in 2003 with a generous donation from Master Shin and founded by Dr. Lou Lancaster and my father, Min Badu Sankale. So, and we, so far we have digitized 500 texts, Sanskrit texts, which we found in all over the world, from different libraries like Harvard, Berkeley, all over, from Europe, Oxford. So it's very, it's a great pleasure for me to announce today that I want to do the app for this project, and so it makes a scholar and a student, they can use it more efficiently. They don't need to log into the computer. They can just see our text in their apps, in their iPhones. So this is the page here, and just click it. And you can find there's two languages, two scripts, Devanagari and Romanized. And some people, especially the Indian Nepalese, they're used to the Devanagari script, so they can see from there in that version. And for Western scholars, they can use Romanized, so you can see Sutra Pitaka, Sastra Pitaka, and Vinipeda. So our university is doing all the classification of the text, what we find all over the world. And here, Sutra Pitaka, you can click here. So we also classify the subcategories, right? So Tantra, Mahayana, Sutra, Pragyaparmita, Dharani. You can see all. So here, Pragyaparmita. So there's lots of Pragyaparmita texts in this group, right? So you can see Asta Sasrika, Lou favorite text, and here, Hriday Sutras, sort. So you can see the text here, and also the bibliography, so where this comes from. So Mahayana Sutra Sangraha, Piyal Vaidya, Mithlai Sura, postcards from Darbhanga. So this one is iPhone 101, the version 101. So in future we will add search engine, and you can search the word, keyword, and find all the iPhone extent. So this is just our first step. Hope in the future we will have more. So right now we have 300 texts online already, so you can look at it. And besides that, I want to thank all the President Morgan who supported us from the day one, and my supervisor Jenny Vamora, and our Bill Chen who funded, who helped to do all the things. and you can see some people. This is my father, late father, on the lots of people working on this. And also the people who are working in Nepal, so we can't forget because they key in all the texts. Thank you.
So the launch of the Digital Sanskrit Buddhist Canon app is very apropos as an entree into this event. As many of you know, Dr. Lancaster has many dimensions to his career, and one of them has a digital risk taker. And you can see that in the projects that he's undertaken himself, but also in support of projects such as this. So thank you, Lou. Before we formally begin with our panel discussion, I thought we would have a few words beginning with Dr. Morgan, President Morgan.
Thank you, Nikki. Maroj, congratulations. We have an exceptional faculty in religious studies here at the University of the West, always doing work that's bringing more knowledge to Buddhist studies, bringing more information to those who are students. And we thank you, Maroj, for the work that you've done and for the support that he receives from his colleagues in his department. I'm looking around the room and I'm looking at the panel, and I'm thinking that nowhere in the world is there more Buddhist power right now than right here at University of the West. And how exciting it is on a Friday afternoon to have this kind of gathering, these distinguished scholars. We have the abbot from Shilai Temple, Reverend Venerable. We're happy to have you here. I think when the Grand Master started Shilai University, later to become University of the West, he had in mind that we would bring groups of scholars together to study Buddhism and Buddhist ways. He also wanted us to bring East and West together so that we could learn what we have in common and what our common ground is as individuals, as scholars, as faithful people. And we have achieved that this afternoon, bringing all of this group together, bringing these scholars together. Dr. Buswell is returning. He had a book signing right here and a book introduction in this room as well. We're delighted to have Dr. Payne with us today. And of course, Lou Lancaster, the guest of honor. I think of him as my visiting counselor. He comes to campus once a month. He and I always have an opportunity to spend time together. He knows the history of University of the West. He was here in the very beginning. He has served as president, so he knows what that role is like. And he has been extremely valuable to me. And I think that the picture in the book is just a little too stern. I just think he's much more friendly. But I know he wanted to look scholarly. He doesn't need to look scholarly. He is scholarly. He is a scholar. He is a person that we take great pride in having affiliated with University of the West. He travels the world over, and my hope is that he's constantly talking about his relationship to University of the West. As he travels, as he lectures, he's in great demand. It's a privilege for us to have him with us. I know that he also lectures at Shilai Temple, and Venerable Weidong has invited him to return time after time because he is such an important resource for all of us. So we're pleased, Dr. Payne, you have honored Dr. Lancaster, and what a delight it is to have the three of you here with us today to share in this introduction of this book. Thank you.
Thank you, President Morgan. I'd like to welcome the abbot of Shilai Temple and have Venerable Weidong say a few words to us today.
Good afternoon, Professor Lancaster, Professor Payne, and Professor Buswell, President Morgan, and distinguished professor, and also students at U West and all the guests. So great to be here this afternoon to be part of this event for the release of the new book, and also for celebrating and also for honoring Dr. Lancaster's achievement in the Buddhist studies, and also in promoting Buddhism around the world. And yesterday afternoon, I had a talk with Dr. Lancaster over for a scholar, for a professor over 80 years old. He's still traveling around the world and also leading so many huge projects to promote Buddhism. To me, he's truly a bodhisattva. His practice is not meditation. It's not or a very traditional way of practice, but he's doing studies of Buddhism and promoting Buddhism around the world for his most of his time. So I really appreciate Dr. Lancaster's contributions to Buddhism, and also, of course, to University of the West. And as President Morgan just mentioned, Dr. Lancaster is our former president of the University of the West, and he inspired and taught so many people, so many students, and many of his students are established professors right now, and also there his students and now also are teaching students. And I think we have generations of scholars inspired by Professor Lancaster. So congratulations, great to be here. And also I want to congratulate Miroj for that great act. Thank you.
Now, if I properly introduce our guests for today, that would, their wonderful dossiers would probably take up the whole event. So I'm going to make my introductions very brief and have them engage in conversation. We'll have Dr. Payne introduce the volume, followed by some comments by Dr. Buswell and comments from Lou. But first I'd like to introduce Dr. Richard Payne, who is Dean and Rehan Numada Professor of Japanese Buddhist Studies at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert Buswell. And Dr. Buswell is the Irving and Jean Stone Endowed Chair of Humanities at UCLA, where he's also Distinguished Professor of Buddhist Studies and Founding Director of the Center for Buddhist Studies and the Center for Korean Studies. And I believe Dr. Louis Lancaster needs no introduction to all of us, so please help me welcome. Please start.
I just wanted to be clear that it was that I was being cued here.
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today at this event. It's an honor to have an opportunity to participate in honoring my teacher for the years of work that he's done, starting the program at UC Berkeley in 1972, still one of the most important centers of Buddhist studies in the United States and the West, I believe, today. Perhaps a word about the title. The notation is set theory notation, and it's properly read as scripture is to canon as text is to context. The challenge of attempting to come up with a unifying theme that would bring together work by at least many of the students that have worked together over the years was rather large. Lou's students have gone in a number of different directions. Unlike some professors who direct their students in a fairly narrow path, he set this the skills to go off in our own directions. And for that, it's just my appreciation. Recently, Lou has been posting some of his old papers on academia.edu, which if you have not looked at, I would encourage you to go and look at. And in one of those, he talks about his own transformation of his attitude towards the nature of the text. Instead of the traditional textual studies approach of looking for an or text, a primal text, a source text, the text from which all of the versions derive, he's talked about there about a text as a moment in a history. That there is no or text to be uncovered, but rather that we have a number of processes of textualization going on. This is, I think, in a sense, a very Buddhist attitude towards texts. The texts are important to us, but they are also representations of our history and representations of the development and change of that history and how it is that we stay current with thinking rather than staying tied to the past. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess I get an opportunity to say a few words as well. This has been kind of a period of reminiscence for the past couple of weeks for me. I was invited up to Berkeley 2 weeks ago to give a keynote address for a quite large event commemorating the 40th anniversary or so of the foundation of the program in Buddhist Studies at Berkeley. And just to see how that program has flourished over the years really reminded me how serendipitous scholarship can be and really how serendipitous life can be sometimes. I first really ran across, almost quite literally, Lou Lancaster in the central square at the monastery where I was in Korea. And Lou had arrived with a whole gaggle of graduate students and tourists and photographers and architects in tow, doing a tour of Buddhist monasteries in Korea, where he was researching the monastic architecture and life of Korean monasteries. So I happened to come across them in the Madang at Songgwangsa, and ended up kind of traveling around with him for a couple of, several days afterwards, maybe about a week or so. This must have been back in 1977 or so, I believe. And it was the first time in about 5 years that I had been around lay people. So it was very curious, to talk with these lay people who were all Buddhist scholars. It seemed all they wanted to talk about were their children. Right? Very puzzled me, actually. But later on, about a couple years later, I was going to be coming back to the U.S. to try to get a book into print that I had been working on. And so I happened to contact Professor Lancaster, and he said, well, while you're in the U.S., why don't you come by Berkeley? You can sit on some of my seminars while you're here. So I ended up at a little Zen center in the Berkeley Hills just off campus and began to sit in his seminars and realized how much I really missed scholarship, and here I am, 30-some years later. But as I thought back to how we get to these points in our lives and how we choose what we end up working on as scholars, I would doubt Lou had any idea when he arrived at Berkeley in 1972 or so that he was going to end up becoming a specialist in the Korean Buddhist canon. I think it probably was just serendipitous that Berkeley happened to be one of only 12 places outside Korea that received a full print, a full xylographic print of the woodblocks of the Haeinsa Korean canon. I sure as I began to look at it and wonder, how do you use this thing? There's no catalog, so sure enough, there we go. And started off on developing this massive catalog of the Korean Buddhist canon that has led to really a lifetime of work on different and related aspects of canonical formation, of digitization of canons. Lou was instrumental in helping the Haeinsa team prepare the first digitization of a complete East Asian Buddhist canon some years ago as well. And so all of these decisions that we make often really are not decisions, they're sort of opportunities that drop in our lap that we either choose to take advantage of or not. And in my own case, Richard asked me to talk a little bit about what I had exhibited in the volume. This is a version of paper that has a very long lifespan. It seems to be getting better each generation, fortunately. It's about the formation and the editing of the Korean Buddhist canon. Certainly not a topic that I probably would have ever decided to take on, were it not for the fact that Lou Lancaster worked on the Korean Buddhist canon. So one summer I decided, well, why don't I take a look at these collation notes that the editor of the Korean Buddhist canon had made as he was preparing the original edition of this text back in the 13th century. This was a 30 fascicle long collection of materials that really is a fascinating insight into the whole process by which one comes to develop a traditional Buddhist canon, and the kinds of decisions and the various sort of canons that he used in preparing his Buddhist canon. And it really provided fascinating insight into the whole process of scholarly production in the 13th century and really how sophisticated it was for that period. Many of the canons that the editor, Sugi, used in developing this traditional canon are identical to the same kinds of canons that we use today in textual editing, whether it's of the New Testament or of classical documents in the West. You could really see the sort of decisions he makes are the kind of decisions that later editors will also have to make. And I think, again, on the serendipitous aspect, when I first came back to graduate school, I was still very much into sort of monastic mode and studying Buddhist thought and philosophy, and began to do Sanskrit, and was really thinking very seriously about doing my dissertation on Sanskrit Dharma materials, using both Sanskrit and Chinese. And I remember having a conversation one day with Lou about what I might want to do for my dissertation. And Lou has this very interesting way of sort of nudging students along. As Richard says, you have some professors who sort of tell you, this is going to be your topic, and if you want to do anything with me, you're doing Buddha Savastivada Vidya, that's it. Lou never does this at all. But, so I sort of broached this idea, well, what about doing something on Abhidharma using Chinese and Sanskrit? Nobody really looks at these Chinese sources. And Trojan said, well, Robert, probably don't want to forget this Korean thing you've got going here. And sure enough, I thought, well, maybe there is something here, actually. And so I began to also think about how I could kind of go back to my interest in Korean Buddhism. And at the same time, Lou was doing a seminar in another area that he had sort of discovered actually has some very interesting work going on, which is the area of Buddhist apocryphal scriptures. And Lou has this uncanny ability to kind of sniff out new developments in the field and sort of entice students, not really force them, but sort of entice them into exploring these new areas. And so I was able to combine this interest that I had in Korean Buddhism with this new area of study of Buddhist apocryphal scriptures to develop a dissertation, eventually a book. So once again, I think this is all serendipity, and very fortuitous serendipity, in fact. So it's a great honor to have the opportunity to contribute this very small token of appreciation to Lou in his volume. It's the one thing I thought I could do that really would sort of honor what has been a lifelong interest of his, but also represent something that I could bring to this new area of study as well. So thank you very much. I guess you're up.
I think you've blown my cover. Well, as I look at everybody in the room, realize how many of you, I look at you and I think about our times together and what we've done and the role you played with me. It's impossible to recount all of that, but to at least say to all of you who've done it, thank you very much. And to these two, I was saying to Jane, I feel like I really never had students. I had colleagues. They taught me more than I taught them. Both of these scholars knew more about their field than I will ever know about their field or ever did know. Robert's living in Korea for 7 years as a monk. There's no way that any knowledge that I have would ever have equaled his. And Richard's work with Japanese Buddhism was unparalleled in terms of my experience with it. So I just sat at their feet in these seminars and listened to them teach me. And that's one of the wonderful things that graduate students have done for me. And I can't help but mention a couple of people who are in the room. I want to say thank you to Bante Chowchun. He's been a real part of my life in terms of introducing me to the fact that he is one of the great leaders of Buddhism. He is part of the World Fellowship of Buddhists, and he is a part of the ruling group for the United Nations Day of Vesak. He's always included me and always made me a part of that tradition and brought me into that world. And I don't want to miss this opportunity to say thank you so much for that. I'd also like to say thank you to Miao-Shi, Venerable Miao-Shi. She's always been such a great supporter and helper in terms of my contacts with Shilai Temple, but with Bogon Shun in particular. And now that she's head of publications, working with her again in other places. To both of them, I'd like to give a special thanks. The book came as a complete surprise. I had no idea. And suddenly, an email from Richard. You know, we both live in the Bay Area, but we never see each other down here. You never see your neighbor except as you travel. I was overwhelmed. I never expected it, and it was one of those very nice surprises of life that I know represented on the part of Richard an enormous amount of work. You know, to get scholars to turn in a paper that you could put into a book that has a deadline. I've done enough of that, but I know exactly what you went through, and I appreciate what I know was a long and horrendous journey to get all that together, and I really appreciate it. And Robert, as he's told you, we've had a very long friendship and experience together with the Korean side, and it would have been a sorrow to me not to have his article in the book, and I really appreciate it, because it represents, as you said, a lot of years of contact and work together. I don't know, I've retired 3 times. My wife says I don't read the manual, so I don't know how to do it. And if I would just read the manual instead of trying to figure out how to do it, I would do better. But I feel really blessed in my life. My sister, who is here, Jared Pelton, has always been a great supporter of me. She has always helped me, and I came to Los Angeles because of her, and I came to USC to study because of her, since she was living in Beverly Hills at the time, and I have to thank her in a way for the serendipitous opening of doors. She helped open that door for me, and it's wonderful. And working with your president now, Dr. Morgan, with Steve, it's a real privilege. I'm so happy after years and years of working here at US to see somebody in the presidency who knows what it's all about. I knew when I was president, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just winging it. We have somebody who is truly a person with the experience and with the insights and with the dedication to this lifelong development of higher education, and we're really lucky to have pleased to be a part of that. So I thank you all for coming in to this event. I don't want to take a lot of your time. As I say, I feel I've lived a kind of charmed life. I took my first class in Buddhist theme. Now it's been 60 years ago. I have never lost my interest in Buddhism or in Buddhist studies. I have never felt that I have exhausted it. I've never felt bored by it. The opportunities for study just keep opening and expanding. And I would say the greatest compliment these two gave to me today is, in a sense, saying I've never produced clones as students. And I really appreciate that. I would have hated to do that. It is just, to me, the worst possible way to teach people that both of you could develop. So I thank you for that. So my heart is full. I thank you all very much for this wonderful event. I thank you for the book. And I thank all of you.
Richard, it might be good to speak about maybe some of the other contributions in the book. I know that you have many wonderful authors in there.
You mentioned the difficulty of sometimes getting people to respond, and I think that my most memorable events in working on the collection was the series of emails that stretched over, in some cases, a long time, trying to get people to actually deliver. As I mentioned, Buddhist students range over quite a wide variety of topics. The first article is by Carl Bielefeld. It was a public talk rather than a formal paper. But he's been involved with Gary Snyder for a long time, and it's reflections on Gary Snyder's contributions. Less of a formal one. Mark Blum has worked primarily on medieval Japanese Buddhism and the Pure Land tradition, and this is a contribution based on that research, conflicts and conversations in Japanese Buddhism. Robert's talked about his, which is perhaps the most technical essay in the collection. Actually, you're correct, you said it's not an essay, you use some other word for it, chapter or project or something like that, because it really represents a study of how canon is formed, and the details in there. And there was some back and forth with me in between the layout person and Robert trying to get some of the details of the positioning and the punctuation and the arrangement of the material just right, because that's very important when you're dealing with a text like the one that he presents there. Ron Davidson has worked on really the transition into Tantric Buddhism in medieval India, and is one of the only people I know of who has really competency, who works on Tantra, competency in both the Sanskrit materials and the Tibetan materials and the Chinese. And his work on Dharani. This is one of a series, as you can see it's noted as number 3, a series of essays that he's written on the development of Dharani, which is an area that, as we shifted away from emphasis on understanding the doctrine alone, has become an area of increasing interest. How did these texts being? What was the practice like? Ron Kritzer's work on embryology, and one of the things about that I feel very strongly about is that Buddhism in the West is often compartmentalized as a religion, and that doing so keeps the fullness of the tradition from becoming available. As Buddhism moved, it brought with it a wide range of cultural practices, cultural knowledge, including embryology, which comes as a big surprise to people. What were these priests and monks doing writing on embryology? I was in Prague a number of years ago, and there's a monastery there that has a huge natural history collection. Monks and nuns were one of the people who had the leisure time to invest in studying the natural world. And that's as true in Europe as it is in the history of Buddhism. So when we compartmentalize Buddhism as a religion, certain aspects tend to get emphasized, and the rest of the richness of the tradition tends to get marginalized and forgotten. So Ron's contribution on embryology, I think, is important. My own contribution here is on attempting to look at the history of practice in the same way that we look at the history of doctrine. Both of them are recorded in text. Both of them we know from texts. And yet they have different kinds of historical trajectories. I was mentioning at lunch that the fire ritual, the homa that I have studied, has not only does it find a home in Tantric Buddhism, but it also finds a home in Tantric traditions in India, outside of Buddhism, but also in Taoism and in Shinto. So the practices themselves have their own history as distinct from the history of doctrine. And I think it's just as important to take that as the object of study. Again, both of them depend upon the study of texts. Ken Tanaka is a Pure Land specialist in the Jodo Shinshu school. His contribution on Shinran, the idea of Shinjin, of heart, faith, mind, is one that is central to that tradition, and he traces that back through the history of Buddhist thought to Indian Tathagata Dharma. So there's a continuity there. One of the other aspects of the concept of what it means to be a religion in the West is that you have a specific founder. And oftentimes that founder is treated as a novelty. So the continuity of Shinran's thought reaching back to Indian Buddhist thought is a different perspective on understanding how someone like Shinran, writing several hundred years ago, was part of a tradition, that rather than only seeing him as a creator of a set of novel ideas. The last one is on justifying the choice of Mahayana among multiple paths by Yao Ming Tsai, and this is working from the Paramita Sutras. Yao Ming is now in Taiwan, and I think is perhaps one of the closest followers of your own interest in the Paramita. So this is a nice closing to the volume to bring the study of the perfection of wisdom back in as the final essay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. As a way to close the event, we acknowledge that, Dr. Lancaster Liu is a very humane scholar. He's a scholar with many dimensions. so the way we want to draw close is we're going to have a presentation of a certificate by the Engaged Buddhist Alliance. So I'd like to introduce Venerable Di Hong, Margaret Melanie, and John Freeze.
Things to say. John, you first.
So we wanted to offer gratitude to Dr. Lancaster. He's provided a number of students at University of the West with the opportunity to teach classes on Buddhism in prisons. He approached us a couple of years ago with the idea, and he had a friend in San Diego, Danny Tam, with International Bodhisattva Society, who was already going into prisons, and there was a number of Buddhist groups already set up. So basically he made it very easy for us to join into this stream that was already there. So Dr. Lancaster has gone with us into the prisons, and yeah, it's very moving, very inspiring to be with him. It's very hot. Sometimes we go to a prison out in the desert, and he still wears his tie. And I think he wants to provide the students in the prison with the same professionalism that he would provide any students anywhere. So, and then, yeah, when we're in the classroom working with the students. He's very, very present, and the atmosphere, I think, really touches the students in a deep way. And I've really seen them see themselves in a different way, where they really see themselves as someone with a curious mind, investigating mind, kind of like just the fundamentals of curiosity and scholarship. And then I've seen how that has worked both ways, that the students have also taught Dr. Lancaster he really means that when he says it, that it's a flow, it's like a symbiotic flow that's happening. So we wanted to express our gratitude that he's provided us with the opportunity to keep going, and he's serving on the board of the Engaged Buddhist Alliance, and then he still, from time to time, comes with us to the prison.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for the chance, and not only that, it gives me something to do instead of sitting in the monastery, But with the courses, there are other Buddhist services would go into prison, but they mostly only meditate or do yoga. But with our group, we teach them Buddhism. We do academic study, and these men, at least almost 100 men now, they are much happier, and they find peace in the prison through the study as well as through their writing, because we make them write. They have to turn in their papers, and that makes a lot difference, because through reading they're able to understand not just the subject, but they understand themselves, and that's very, very important. And if any of you haven't heard Dr. Lancaster's lecture in the prison, I highly recommend that you go, because it's completely different than it is out here.
You might want them to see a recording, not
We can't bring anything.
Okay, we want to be clear about what we mean by when we say we want you to go to prison. We are asking if you would maybe like to come help us in the prisons. We don't actually want to see you go to prison. And I think that this is an opportunity to bring together some of the themes that have surfaced this afternoon. The theme of someone who's a risk taker, because some people would say, ooh, going to prisons, that's scary with a risk. The theme of launches, launching the app for digital Sanskrit, which I think is super cool. But no, I won't try to use it for the final. And the nudging people in a direction and then kind of letting them see where it will go, because Dr. Lancaster came and shared this idea with us, and then he stood back and let us see what we would do with it. And so we, in collaboration with the University of the West, created a nonprofit called the Engaged Buddhist Alliance. And there are quite a few people around the room who have been helping in this effort. And not everyone is here, but so if you're a person who has helped, advised, or something, would you please raise your hand? Come on. And you have the camera. Oh, everyone's being shy, but I can see people in the room who I know have gone into the prisons. I'm looking right at you. So anyway, you have nudged us in a direction that has changed our lives. And so we thank you for being the founder of the Engaged Buddhist Alliance and for sharing your wisdom and compassion with us and encouraging us to move forward. That certificate from Dr. and Dr.
University of the West and Engaged Buddhist Alliance present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Louis Lancaster, founder of the Prison Initiative, a collaboration between University of the West and the Engaged Buddhist Alliance, with profound gratitude for his guidance and support through the years. His compassion and wisdom are an inspiration to us all. Thank you.
They really are doing wonderful work, and it's very little to do with me. It has to do with them. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I'd like to thank our guests today, Dr. Richard Payne, Dr. Robert Eswell, and of course Lou, also all of you. And thank you, Lou, as always, our deepest gratitude. Thank you.